What's up, ego hackers? Welcome to the Cutting Edge Podcast. I'm your host, C.S. Joseph, naturally, mini campfire edition. Of course, gotta have the mini campfire and the other mini campfire, please. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. We're going to be discussing. UCT again. You guys' favorite subject. You guys like you some UCT? Huh? Let's hear it. Let's hear it for some UCT. Getting ready for the awesome, with our continued UCT discoveries that we've been having. Gotta love UCT. All right. So, let's do a quick refresher of what UCT actually is. UCT is Universal Compatibility Theory, originally discovered by Mr. Phibb. That guy right there. Him. And as the raid boss of typology, I have been refining the theory since then. And it's now not so much a theory. UCT is basically a truth, as near as we can tell. But it's the concept of feminine primary functions versus masculine primary functions within a particular type. And how you identify this is you identify somebody's octogram and their type. You can't identify their type without knowing their octogram, although you can suspect their octogram, use that suspicion to identify their type, and then circle it back to octogram and then know their octogram. But for the most part, you have to know their type and their octogram in order to actually know their UCT. UCT is the process by which you identify their primary masculine function, their secondary masculine function, as well as their primary feminine function and their secondary feminine function. So we do this by looking at the Ego Hacking Your Fear masterclass, where we discuss certain functions are favored by different types and different subvariants of types according to the octogram. So for example, SDSF types favor their child and inferior functions. UDSF types favor their hero and parent functions. SDUF types favor their nemesis and their critic functions, and UDUF types favor their trickster and demon functions. Now, if they are a man, it's whichever function out of those two functions is introverted. If they are a woman, it's whatever function is out of that set of functions that is extroverted. As a result, this is how you find the UCT. Their UCT, which is their feminine, masculine primary function, or their either one of those. Now, here's the kicker, folks, is that, let's say, for example, we got Mr. Phibb here. So his masculine primary function is introverted sensing, right, because he's SDSF. That means his secondary masculine function happens to be, secondary primary masculine function is introverted thinking, right? Whereas I have the reverse because I am UDSF. You know, TI is my primary, right? Whereas SI is my secondary. So because of that, our lives are a little bit different. Both of us are subconscious focused. And so this is basically how you find your UCT. Obviously, when it comes to secondary feminine functions, laser guns is extroverted feeling, feminine primary. So her secondary function is going to be extroverted sensing, right? That is her secondary. And then basically you have a primary decision-making function and a secondary perception function, or vice versa, and that's how it works for men and women. So if SI is your primary in terms of Phibb, then TI is your secondary, but his primary is perception, whereas my primary is decision-making. From that point of view. So this is like an extra layer deeper when it comes to considering the UCT theory, right? It's an extra layer. And understanding how the secondary works. But then if it really is something we could label secondary, that's still debatable. Chris and I are still working that out. Phibb and I are still working that out. But basically the main point is like, okay, if you're having whatever your octogram is, that's your absolute highest primary function, regardless. And then that tells you, like, okay, since my masculine primary function is TI, I value decision-making above perception, right? But perception is still important. It's just in a secondary role for me, even though it is my primary masculine perception function in of itself. It's like a separate category there, okay? So there's these attributes. And these attributes are absolutely important in order for me to like actually demonstrate my final point, which is internalization and externalization of functions, where I'm basically going to hammer that point home so that both Duggo and Uberzerker will never challenge me on this point again. Just remember, when you identify someone's masculine primary function or feminine primary function, the next question you have to ask is this a perception function or is a judgment function? Because if it is a judgment function, they highly value within their masculinity or their femininity that approach, that role, right? That, they highly value that judgment from that perspective if it's a judgment function, or they highly value that perception if it's a perception function, regardless if they're a man or a woman. Okay, that's the first point. But here's the thing. What you really need to start asking is, okay, well, hold on. Does that mean that there are certain octograms and certain types that are more masculine or more feminine than others? Yes. Yes, there are. Yes. So when it comes to the difference of understanding these functions, there's something that really, really, really matters when it comes to internalization versus externalization theory that we've been talking about. But when you're looking at internalization versus externalization of your functions, if they are optimistic functions, they're really going out of the way to be a source, and they're really going out of the way to be pushed onto others. It's push versus pull energy, right? Pull energy is pessimistic functions. So if you have a TI, masculine primary function, it's pessimistic, right? It's really pessimistic, and because of that, it's actually very solipsistic. It's very it's very solipsistic. So this gives you a concept of hyperfeminine versus hypermasculine types with particular octogram variants. Okay, and folks, this is probably going to be super confusing, but I'm trying my best here because there's just a lot of data, and even if I tried to whiteboard this, it probably still wouldn't make sense even with the visual aid. Okay, so just bear with me for a little bit. Okay, so you have hyperfeminine and you have hypermasculine. What does hyperfeminine or hypermasculine actually mean? Okay, so if your masculine primary function, okay, is an optimistic function, that means you are a hypermasculine variant of your type. Okay, so we have BM Christie joining us. Mr. BM Christie, we love you, bro. You're the man. You're an ISTP dope-ass mother effer. Okay, so you being a UDSF ISTP means your masculine primary function is introverted thinking. Because it is in an optimistic slot within your ego, meaning that it is a hero function or a child function, but yours is a hero function specifically. That means as a UDSF ISTP man, you are a hyper masculine version of the ISTP, one of the most masculine types out there, because it is in an optimistic slot. Hyper masculine, extra masculine, right? Extra masculine. And the reason why is because optimism is very externalized. It's very externalized. Optimism is very tribe above self because it's where the masculine idealism is actually piped out through your cognitive functions. Now, conversely, we have Bubbles on the stream right now. Welcome to being my new target. Love you, Bubbles. Bubbles is an ENTP woman with extroverted feeling child primary, right? Extroverted feeling child, right? Or then you have lady who's also present. You have extrovert feeling feminine primary. Okay, extrovert feeling feminine primary. But here's the thing: it's in a pessimistic slot. Pessimistic slots are more solipsistic. Pessimistic slots are self above tribe. Pessimistic slots are. So, because her feminine primary function is in a pessimistic slot, as a woman, it makes her hyper feminine, extra feminine than other women, because it's in her ego in that slot, basically. So you have the hyper feminine, you have the hyper masculine. Okay, this is very important knowing. And then you have people like me and Fib, who have like extroverts who have our masculine primary functions in our pessimistic slots, okay? So when you think about it, introverted women with their feminine slots being in pessimistic within their ego, right? Introverted women have the opportunity to be hyper feminine, and introverted men who have their slots the way they are more masculine, hyper masculine. But when you look at extroverted women and you look at extroverted men, it's entirely the reverse. Okay? Extroverted women end up having a balance of masculinity and a balance of femininity within them, potentially, or not at all. So let's look at an ENTJ man. Let's look at an ENTJ. It's like an ENTJ man who is SDSF, right? So introverted feeling is his masculine primary function. But given that it is in a pessimistic slot, it's really solipsistic. It's very self above tribe. So it's not as idealistic. So they have a little bit less masculinity than like a hypermasculine type, right? Same thing goes with an ENTJ woman who is SDSF from that perspective. Her feminine primary function is an optimistic slot. It's very idealistic. It's very tribe above self in its own right. So therefore, it's not as feminine. It's actually very masculine. That's why ENTJ women end up having this thing where they are even more. They're even more masculine than before. So this is where you can start making the argument that ENTJ women and ESTP women are way more masculine than an INTJ woman or an ISTP woman. I know previously that we've had, and this is where I'm probably going to have to issue a retraction, but previously we maintained that the four most masculine women of all the types are STP women and NTJ women. But now because of UCT, that's been basically completely blown out of the water. It has everything to do with what their octagram is. You have to kind of know what their octagram is to be able to make that distinction. But the fact that they're introverted or that they're extroverted with their nature also determines their level of femininity or their level of masculinity as well. Because extroverts have the opportunity to have more balance with their femininity and more balance with their masculinity. So anyway, from this perspective, you could see how even an ISTP woman, depending on her octagram, if she is subconscious focused, basically, an ISTP woman who's subconscious focused, they are hyper feminine, right? If they're unconscious focused, that's not the case, right? Their level of that's when their femininity is a little bit more, it's more balanced against their masculine when they're unconscious focused. Because here's the reality, folks. Dropping a truth bomb here. If you are unconscious focused as a woman, you are more in your masculine energy. If you are more subconscious focused as a woman, you are more in your feminine energy. If you are subconscious focused as a man, you are more in your masculine energy. If you are unconscious focused as a man, you are more in your feminine energy. And oftentimes, unconscious focused men are using unconscious focus as a way to discover that which makes them masculine, or discover what they can actually utilize to become masculine after the fact, which is very fascinating if you think about it, because they're very outward. Because here's the thing, like when you're unconscious focused, and I could pick on Jordan a little bit because guess what? I'm a hypocrite because I was UDUF practically all last year, like entirely all last year, for the most part. Like basically from last summer till the previous summer, I was entirely UDUF. I came out of UDUF basically just about kind of the end of May-ish, June-ish, basically. But that's where it comes from. But yes, Gatecrasher, you're making a great point. This is the true explanation of the anima versus animus, essentially. Jung's description is wrong. It just needs to be updated with this perspective. And then also the perspective of my mentors, my ESTP mentor, Robert Bryant, and then his son, Robert Moriel, his INFJ son, Robert Moriel, my two mentors, like they entirely missed this. So it's really important to understand these distinctions. Because think about it. An unconscious focused woman, what is actually happening to her octagram? What is happening? All of her living virtues and aspiration poles are introverted. So they are in pull energy, right? They're pulling that from other people. All of her deadly sins and her shadow pole is extroverted. They are pushing that onto other people, right? So they're very outward. They're pushing it onto others. But here's the problem. When it's introverted, they're sucking up all of the living virtues. Basically, they're sucking up all the compassion in the room. They're sucking up all the gratitude in the room, right? They're sucking up all of these things, okay? And when that's happening, that's when they are hypersolipsistic, okay? They are hypersolipsistic, right? And it's very, very self above tribe entirely, okay? And this ends up becoming a problem, right? But they're not really in their feminine, their true feminine, without going onto the tribe above self side, which is more of the subconscious side, right? Because you have to have that balance between tribe above self and self above tribe from that perspective. So from the octagram point of view, it's backwards, okay, compared to the nature side of where your feminine primary function is compared to your masculine primary function as a man, okay? So it's backwards, okay? So, because here's the thing, women are inherently solipsistic by nature, but their nurture has to be tribe above self. You see what I'm saying? That's why that they are at their most feminine, their most complete form when they are in their subconscious focus. Same for men. Men are their most masculine because they're giving their gifts to the world. They're giving their living virtues to the world. They're giving their aspiration poles to the world, essentially, from that perspective. So you could argue, if you're just going to ignore nature entirely, just from an octagram perspective, SDSF would be the most masculine man out there because they are pushing everything, their aspiration pole and their living virtues on everyone. Because when you're subconscious focused, you have access to all of the living virtues because the temple influences, due to temple influence theory. Temple influence means that you have 4 types that are in the same temple, but then, like, for example, if you're an INFJ man, right, your brain is soul temple in ego, but your shadow has a heart temple influence, even though your ENFP shadow, it's a heart temple ENFP variant, basically, due to temple influence, right? So based on that, you have to come to the conclusion that, okay, well, SDSF as an octagram variant is ultimately the most outward expression. It's the most idealistic, right? But when you go back to UCT and look at it from a nature side, the waters get muddied, right? Because then you have to look at the feminine primary function versus the masculine primary function, right? So internalization versus externalization of functions, pessimistic functions are naturally on their own more solipsistic, right? They really lean into the pull energy when it comes to people, versus optimistic functions really invest in the push energy, which means optimistic functions are more idealistic, therefore they are technically more masculine from a nature side of things, okay? And pessimistic functions are more solipsistic from a nature side of thing as well, which means it's actually possible for an ISTP woman who starts out in life really super masculine to actually become hyper feminine. Just like an INTJ woman, it's the same thing. They can start out in their life super masculine, but actually end up being hyper feminine, right? And the ones that actually end up doing that is basically as a result of being subconscious focused. God, I hope I'm making sense right now. I really hope I'm making sense. This is so hard to explain. This is like really, really hard to explain. But yeah, like that's the point. There are these hyper masculine versions and hyper feminine versions. But here's the thing: like, as people are really invested, it's the subconscious focused introverts who lean in heavily within their masculine and feminine energies, whereas their extroverted counterparts, they're kind of more balanced. Versus, so it's either they're all in or they're all out, basically from an introvert's perspective. But from an extrovert's perspective, it's more of, okay, well, this energy is more primary for me right now. The other one's more secondary for me right now. But then they can switch as they transition through their octagram throughout their life based on their cognitive focus changing. So, all right. So based on that, does anyone have any questions? Because I think questions might actually help the audience understand what's actually happening here. Any questions? Okay. All right. So are introverted men less extroverted men less masculine? Okay, so look at it this way. I have introverted thinking, masculine, primary, but it is in a pessimistic slot, okay? So because of that, it's not as masculine because it's not as masculine because it's in a pessimistic slot, basically. So you just look down at the specific functions themselves, okay? It's not as masculine because your masculine primary function has to be in an optimistic slot. So the only way your masculine primary function can be in an optimistic slot, because it has to be in your ego. That's another prerequisite here. Has to be this is coming from your ego, okay? We're not talking about any other sides of the mind. We're just talking straight from the ego. Oh, you're filling in.
Yeah.
All right, cool, nice. All right. So I'm going to try to explain again for everyone. Hopefully I'll get it right this time. So if your masculine primary function is in an optimistic slot, it's way more masculine, okay? And you are a hyper-masculine version of yourself if your masculine primary function is in an optimistic slot. Which means if it is in a pessimistic slot, it is still masculine, but it's not as masculine. There's more of a balance because it's in a pessimistic slot because pessimism has a bit more solipsism in it. Whereas when you have masculine primary functions in optimistic slots, they're way more idealistic, basically.
Give an example. Like T.I. Parent versus T.I. Hero.
T.I. Parent versus T.I. Hero. All right. So B.M. Christie versus me, essentially. So I end up being really solipsistic and very selfish with my own TI because I oftentimes will not correct other people unless it's for my own personal benefit. But when B.M. Christie corrects people, he's doing it for their benefit, essentially. If you look at it from an interest-based point of view, it really comes down like where is a person's interests actually align, okay? From an interest-based perspective. My TI parent has to be correct for the sake of my own solipsistic survival, essentially, because I was UD, right? And I was UD-UF, and I realized that relying on my introverted feeling trickster did me no good. Essentially, I had to utilize my TI and align myself more with the truth and the facts, and again, it was really as a result of my own selfish...
You should drop a bomb. It's not the bomb that we just made, but the...
Which one?
What octagram is each side of the mind? You should drop that right now.
What octagram? I was saving that for the next one. Here's the thing, like when a masculine primary function is in an optimistic slot, they're really about giving, it's not out of self-interest, it's really in the interest of others, basically. That's the whole point we're trying to make here. Whereas when it comes to a feminine primary function in a pessimistic slot, it's really, really solipsistic. And it's really in the interest of themselves. It's not really in the interest of other people, essentially, from that point of view. Because of that, it's hyper feminine, basically. So my TI parent is technically, even though it's my masculine primary, it's technically more feminine than a TI hero or a TI child, is basically the main point that we're trying to make. Okay. All right, Rune, I don't know how old Jordan is. He's in his 20s. That's all I know. I noticed that with FE pessimistic primary women. Okay, what did you notice, Mr. Christie? Yeah, solipsistically emotional. They absolutely are solipsistically emotional. Yes, they are. Because it's all about their own emotions from that perspective. That's why they are extra feminine, because they're extra solipsistic, way extra solipsistic. So, so introverted women who have introverted women who have SE feminine primary, FE feminine primary, like in an INFJ, or TE feminine primary, or SI feminine primary, in like an ISTJ, for example. These women, their feminine primary functions are based on their self-interest more than it is about other people. But then if you look at the other side of it, the extroverted side, like an ESTJ or an ENFJ, their feminine primary functions are actually more masculine because they're about other people's interests. You see what I'm saying? It's all about, in service to other people, right? Because the introverted women are just more solipsistic because of it. That's literally the case. But introverted men are more masculine because of that. It's the extroverts that have more of a balance, provided they're subconscious focused. But when they're unconscious focused, that's not the case. And that's basically the argument we're making. All right, Knox says, do we still apply feminine and masculine labels to interaction styles? I honestly, technically yes, but UCT has completely blown it out of the water, and we're going to be issuing some retractions due to that.
Things will change.
Things are changing, but it'll be updated. Don't worry about it. But like I said, at the beginning of season 31, especially the first 2 episodes, that basically has been debunked at this point. The first 2 episodes of season 31, Jungian sexuality, that's been debunked and being reworked because of UCT.
Should I put capitals debunked in the titles?
Yeah, may as well. So Chase, if you transition to your ISFJ subconscious, would your TI become more masculine? Yes. Yes. The answer is yes. So Stephanie says, my SE primary, is pessimistic and a perception function. Would that enable me to be more than hyperfeminine? Yes, absolutely. Yes, that is another layer deeper, Stephanie. That is correct. That is absolutely correct. So SDSF, INJ women basically have that going for them, from that perspective. Yes, because they're hyper-enabled in that, from that perspective. Yes, there's a lot of implications, based on this. But now, it's not good enough to claim XYZ type is more masculine and feminine than the others, like we initially did. Now we actually can go drill down at the functional level and from an octagram perspective and actually determine how and why that actually is the case. So yes. Thank you all for asking questions so I can provide clarification so the audience actually understands what the hell it is I'm actually saying.
No last questions?
Yeah, any other questions?
Ask the question, how are you doing? But only ask Chase it.
So Stephanie asked, would the layer of judging versus perception balance out optimistic, pessimistic function orientation layer? I already. All right, hold on. Would the layer of judging versus perception balance out optimistic, pessimistic orientation layer? Yeah, I think it would. Yes. Answer is yes, Stephanie, on that. And it would have to, if you think about it, for the sake of the survival of the species, it would absolutely have to. And this is where that balance comes to place. This is why extroverts, that's how extroverts basically end up getting a free pass, because they're not as hyper invested, from that point of view. So yes, no, we already answered that, Bubs.
Example: all the simpy introverts get really, really deep into it, versus extroverts are just less likely to be like simps in men.
Yeah, extroverted men are not likely to be simps, whereas INFJ men, especially INFJ men who are subconscious focused, are hella simps. Same with INTJs. And there's an additional implication. The implication is also this, for example, when they're hella simping like that, these are the types that are more likely to be into monogamy than they are as men, than they are to be into polygyny, basically. Just from that perspective, entirely. Okay? This is why INFJ and INTJ men are usually oh, fuck monogamy, or fuck polygyny, monogamy is the only way to go. You're a piece of shit man if you don't do it this way. I get that from them like all the time. I get that from them the most. And it's just, it's not true. It's based on their own way, which then, for the women out there that do like prefer monogamy, well, it's usually the unconscious focused women that actually do. Until they become subconscious focused, then it's up for debate again. And women change their cognitive focus a lot faster than men do, a lot faster. And here's another way. What did you say earlier about men versus women's development? What did you say?
So,
closer to the microphone. Yeah, right.
So both men and women start out life exactly the same with nothing. Okay, that's just the truth. And the only thing you are given is an octogram and a type, which is basically nature, and you're the beginning of your nurture, right?
Mm-hmm.
The beginning of it.
The beginning of it, yeah.
Now, the men, because they lack their extroverted functions the most when they start out, it takes them a long time to develop. Much longer than women, even physically and evolutionarily. It takes longer to develop. Why is that? Because the extroverted functions is what absorbs from others. Now, women get to start life with nothing also, remind you, with very little. But because they have extroverted functions as their primary functions, they instantly start absorbing this stuff. They start absorbing info, they start seeing what people are doing, they start seeing intentions. And men are basically just starting clueless, and they're rolling around on the floor, and they're confused, right? And then by the time a woman's even 15, they're like already black belts in their extroverted functions, and men are still trying to put the block in the hole, like the square hole, like that meme.
Yeah. Now talk about copying.
Yeah, but the issue is because women are so extroverted, later in life that bites them in the butt, because men get to build things correctly the first time, because introverted basically sort of is like a filter. It's also feedback, but filter and feedback is the introverted, right? Mm-hmm. And so because men get to build things right the first time,
input, process, output,
like
feedback.
Wine. They age like wine.
Yeah.
Right? Versus women, they absorb really quickly, but then they start to decay and they start to plateau, because you can only get so much from seeing from the extra world. At some point, you got to put in the work yourself. Now, I'm gonna drop a weird bomb. I know a lot of people, for example, on the men's and women's group, like push for the whole like, oh well, if you're a man, you just gotta man up and always be a man. And if you're a woman, you never should be masculine at all. But the truth of the matter is, you require both. You require both. And I would argue the distribution should be about 75-25. Yep. This is actually why someone like Chase is so smart. The reason why is because he's digging deep into his TE, which inherently, like I said, TE absorbs thoughts, which via orbit makes him smarter, right? Or for example, Mozart is one of my favorite examples. He's an SE demon. But because he had his musician father taught him everything, which basically supplemented SE, making his SI inferior strong, which was why Mozart became a prodigy from age 3 to 4 or so. Because he had SE, he was in tune with your feminine side. If you're not in tune with your feminine side as a man, you're basically, you hear of like fragile masculinity. That's basically just lack of femininity, ironically. Yeah. And vice versa for a woman. I mean, it's a little bit harder to say the woman's point of view, like how does the introverted functions help a woman? But one example I can think of off the top of my head is a woman needs to be, they need to be more masculine than, for example, their son and their daughter. Yeah. Because it's in order to be able to nurture your son, you have to have power over him, right? Yeah. Because the extroverted functions are the nurturing functions. But if the son is able to rebel, you're not going to be able to have any influence over them. That's the example I can think of. Maybe someone else can drop something in the comments of the video or something. But
another point that was made, and we talked about this earlier, is that men. This is why, due to masculine functions being introverted functions, this is why men create, but creating is so much harder. Whereas women, they just copy. They copy, and this is why every single thing out there is actually originally sourced from men. Bras came from men. Menstrual pads came from men. Heels came from men. Like all of these things were invented by men. Makeup was actually invented by men. Actually, there is makeup, that's predating men in Egypt, predating Mesopotamia, even especially with all the art, and it's men who are the ones wearing makeup and not women, basically, for example. But everything in the entire world is sourced from men. Women can just copy things. They don't create. They copy. That's the difference, essentially.
Yeah, the men build, but the role of a woman is to take what men have built or slash provided and make it better.
Exactly.
To provide extra input, to provide extra sensory based off all of the stuff they've collected. They can provide it to the man, right? That's the woman's role.
Exactly. So when you understand these differences, from a UCT perspective, it's a lot easier to actually see exactly why the extroverted functions are more feminine, and why when an extroverted function is in a pessimistic slot, they're extra solipsistic. Like take for example Stephanie. Stephanie is SDSF. So with her being SD, her outward function is actually recklessness. It's objectification. She's pretty happy just watching me criticize the fuck out of the girls in the cartel, to the point where sometimes she's at risk of being judged by other people as someone who lacks compassion, because of that externalized recklessness from that perspective. And then she spends all of her idealism, or her idealization, shadow pull, on herself, trying to become her ideal self. And from her perspective, hey, if I'm working hard to be perfect, that means I'm okay. It's okay with me. It's fine by me to be reckless with other people and their lives because I'm working hard to be as perfect as possible. But that perfection is as a result of her extroverted sensing feminine primary function, which is basically being a top performer as a result of her self-interest. And it's not really in the interest of other people, right? But if a woman is unconscious developed, it's actually the reverse when you actually see that. You see what I'm saying? Which is a more masculine role, which is why unconscious developed, just looking at just the octagram layer, you could make that argument that there's more masculinity in that woman who's unconscious developed from that point of view, right? And if you understand temple influence, you have all of the deadly sins, all of the living virtues, and all of the shadow poles and all the aspiration poles for every single one of available to your brain, basically, depending on how you cognitive transition into either sides of your minds, and you're relying on the temple influence within your main temple's approach, and the temples are influencing each of the sides of the mind within your own actual temple, okay? And you're having other temples express themselves through your main temple's types, basically, inside your head, all right?
All right. I have something to add. You ready?
Please add. Yeah, add.
All right. So because men start life with nothing but are focused on an introverted function, men default to arrogance in life, while women start with also nothing, but they gain value very quickly. Now that this is hard, but to define. But I argue it's almost like pretentiousness. Women default to pretentiousness, or thinking they provide more value, or thinking higher of themselves than they should. Now, when you look at the definitions, it's hard to say pretentious because it's sort of like a simile to arrogance.
Yeah.
I think the kind of colloquial of the word helps, but maybe someone can help like redefine pretentious. But I just wanted to add that in there, that women tend to think.
Bubs says entitlement.
Entitlement, kind of, but no. It's like,
yeah.
It's like, oh, I'm so pretty. I'm the prettiest girl ever. Like that, versus the men just think they're way more capable than they are, right? This is why men are so reckless when they drive and kill themselves, right? Because men just default to arrogance, right? Women aren't killing themselves driving. It's just because they don't have that introverted arrogance, right? They know their capabilities more, but men are so focused on it that they just default to arrogance.
Which is why men commit suicide more often than women do.
Yeah. But don't run with the word pretentious. I want someone to help me redefine.
They're saying hubris, maybe.
Hubris, maybe, yeah, but someone can help me define
that might be
it,
too
but
strong.
It's an extroverted thing, right? It's thinking that other people think I'm prettier than I am, or I'm smarter than I am, right? Or more caring than I am. Example, so on. more helpful than I am.
Yeah.
For example, I mean, on the women's group, which I've been engaging in more, which is kind of fun. A lot of women get advice, and it's really bad advice, but because of the weird pretentiousness that they have,
Bubble
they
says
think,
conceited now.
what?
Bubble says conceited.
I actually don't know the definition of that.
It's a synonym to hubris. That's why it doesn't work.
Okay. But anyway,
Noxitern says spoiled. Self-spoiling.
No, spoiled is SDUF.
Yeah, spoiled is, yeah.
What's it called? But like, for example, women are giving advice on there, but they way overvalue their advice, and they think it's way more helpful or way more accurate than it actually is.
Yeah.
And if a woman just sat down and actually thought it through and used an introverted function, that would shed off all of the feminine pretentiousness, while vice versa for men default
grandiose. That's pretty. Yeah, it's grandiose. Yeah, it's self-aggrandizement. Thank you, Stephanie. You got it.
Yeah.
TE mastery for you folks. There it is. TE mastery.
Is grandiose.
Yeah.
Anyway, but a woman defaults to grandiose, but only once she starts to get in tune with that, like I said, 25% of her masculine side, that sheds. Right? And vice versa for men. Men default to arrogance, but only once they start to use their feminine side and start to absorb and gain power from the world, that arrogance goes away. And basically, they actually are capable. They're not arrogant anymore, right? Because the capability matches what they think.
That's why men can't just be around a grandiose woman. They just can't deal with it. Unless they're unconscious focused, usually, themselves. Because they're leaning more on that 25% of their feminine versus the grandiose woman is leaning on that 25% of their masculine. And then there's that inherent incompatibility. And this is why together as a couple they can actually kind of grow with the men leading in the direction of subconscious focus, and then she can get to subconscious focus, and then he will eventually become subconscious focus as other men are leading him. Basically. And that's ultimately how it works. So anyway,
are you out of content, or do you have more?
No, I think we hammered this one pretty well. Thank you for joining me on this one. But yeah, just understand the difference between hypermasculinity and hyperfemininity. So Space Cadet says, when I was UF, the grandiose women made every day worse. Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's just kind of interesting. Like, and no offense to Ellie, but Ellie was very grandiose. Was she not? Was she not very grandiose? She was very grandiose. And she was very grandiose. But in general, like, grandiose women are very off-putting to men. In general, arrogant men can be very off-putting to women. But it just depends on whether their cognitive focus actually is. And there's an inherent identifiable compatibility there, though. Anyway, folks, that's it for Cutting Edge December 2023. Probably just as important as the last December 2022 episode we did on soft locking. You could just see the journey of the science and how it's evolved through the Cutting Edge podcast. So thank you all for joining me this evening, and I'll see you guys on the next one. So, see y'all later. Have a good night.